James Carter stood just outside the entrance of the Regal Oak, an upscale restaurant in downtown Charlotte, North Carolina. At 70, he still carried a composed air in his neatly pressed gray suit, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze quietly observing the stream of luxury cars gliding by. Once a U.S. Supreme Court justice, James had left his mark with landmark civil rights rulings, but now retired. He savored the rare anonymity. He was here to meet his granddaughter Olivia, a young lawyer attending an event inside, and as was his habit, he arrived a few minutes early to reflect. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. The Regal Oak glowed with golden light spilling onto the sidewalk, its glass doors reflecting Charlotte's wealth. The doorman stood like a sentinel, guarding the line between privilege and those who didn't belong. James wasn't in a hurry. He glanced at the taxis and sleek cars pulling up to the entrance, where diners stepped out with confident strides. It had been a while since he'd been recognized, since curious stares or whispers trailed his reputation. He liked it that way. Anonymity was a luxury he cherished, but that peace didn't last. Not far off, a patrol car idled near the curb, its engine humming softly in the evening air. Inside, two officers, Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn, had their eyes on him. Tom, younger and cocky, stepped out of the car, smirking. "What's an old black guy like you doing at a place like this?" His lips curled, his gaze raking over James as if he were a smudge on the pristine pavement. Paul, older, followed, his stare cold, jaw clenched. They didn't check his ID, didn't care to. To them, he was just a nameless figure loitering outside a fancy restaurant. Tom Hayes approached James Carter with that smirk still plastered on his face, his posture too casual for someone who relished moments like this. Paul Dunn trailed right behind, hand resting on his belt, fingers brushing the baton's handle, his icy gaze already set on an outcome before speaking. James stood still, not turning immediately, but when Tom's voice cut through, he slowly tilted his head, his calm eyes meeting theirs. "Sir, we need you to move along," Tom said, his tone thick with unwarranted authority and confidence. James took a steady breath, letting the moment settle before responding. His voice was smooth, measured, unshaken by their stares. "I'm waiting for my granddaughter," he said simply, as if that should end it. But Tom's grin only widened, his head tilting slightly as he let out a low chuckle. "Is that so?" he drawled, humoring an explanation he deemed naive. "Thing is, you've been standing here a while, and we've had some complaints about suspicious activity. Can't have people hanging around a classy place like this." James held Tom's gaze, unblinking. "Suspicious activity," he echoed, his tone devoid of curiosity. He already knew what they meant. Paul snorted through his nose, shaking his head as if this were a minor annoyance. "Move it, all right," he said, his voice firm. "We won't ask twice." James didn't budge, his expression unchanged. Instead, he slowly reached into his coat's inner pocket, his movement precise, pulling out a dark brown leather wallet and holding it out. "I assume you'll want to see my identification," he said, his voice still even, like someone who knew the law better than those enforcing it. A brief silence hung, a flicker of irritation crossing Tom's face at James's audacity. Paul's jaw tightened, his eyes flashing with annoyance. Then, without warning, Tom swatted the wallet from James's hand. It hit the pavement with a dull thud near the curb, a few crisp bills and credit cards spilling onto the cold concrete. James didn't flinch. For the first time, his expression shifted, not to anger, not to fear, but to a profound patience, forged over decades, stronger than mere silence. Paul stepped forward, stomping hard on the wallet, grinding it into the sidewalk. "No ID required," he muttered, his voice just loud enough to carry the mockery. Tom let out a short, humorless laugh. "You got a problem following orders, old man?" James let the moment stretch, his eyes locked on them, letting the weight of their actions settle in the air. Then, with quiet certainty, he spoke. "You're making a mistake." Paul exhaled sharply, leaning in closer, his voice dropping. "Yeah," he whispered. "And what do you think's gonna happen here, huh?" James's gaze didn't waver. "You'll find out soon enough," he said, his tone carrying a calm, that subtly shifted the air. A quiet warning neither officer was sharp enough to catch. They'd already decided how this would end, but they were about to learn how wrong they were. Tom laughed louder, stepping closer, near enough for James to catch the cheap cologne and stale coffee on his breath. "Keep telling yourself that," he said, planting a hand on James's shoulder and shoving hard. Paul swiftly moved behind, grabbing James's arm, twisting it with just enough force to hurt, without leaving obvious marks. James didn't resist, didn't struggle, letting them drag him toward the patrol car. He knew the law, and more importantly, he knew what was coming. Olivia, just stepping out of the Regal Oak, froze at the sight before her. "Let him go," she shouted, her sharp voice slicing through the air, heels clacking hard on the pavement as she rushed forward. But Tom barely glanced over, lazily waving a hand. "Back off, lady," he said, his tone bored, like she was a nuisance, not worth the effort. Olivia recoiled, her hands trembling as she pulled out her phone and started recording. "You're making a huge mistake," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. "That's James Carter, former Supreme Court Justice." Tom paused for a second, a flicker of doubt in his eyes, but then he smirked, glancing at Paul. "Supreme Court Justice, huh? Nice one." Paul chuckled faintly, continuing to push James into the back seat. "Guess the old man's been spinning fairy tales for her," he said, slamming the door shut. James sat still in the car, back straight, hands on his lap, showing no fear. He looked at Olivia through the window, his eyes calming her, as if he'd seen this all coming. Tom and Paul didn't realize it, but they just ignited a storm they couldn't extinguish. The patrol car rolled through Charlotte's brightly lit streets, North Carolina, taking James Carter to Precinct 12. Inside, Tom Hayes sat up front, glancing in the rearview with that smirk, while Paul Dunn, hands on the wheel, let out occasional snickers of contempt. "Troublemaking old man," Tom muttered, just loud enough for James to hear from the back. "Thinks he's some kind of judge or something." Paul gave a short laugh, shaking his head. "Probably expects us to bow and apologize for not recognizing his honor," he shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. James sat still, back straight, hands on his lap, eyes on the window, unfazed. He dealt with the arrogance of men who didn't grasp real power before. When the car pulled up to Precinct 12, Tom yanked the back door open, pulling James out with an unnecessary tug. "Let's go, old man," he said, shoving him toward the entrance. Paul flanked him, hand still on his belt, his cold stare treating him like a dangerous criminal. Inside, the precinct hummed with the stale smell of coffee and the whine of an old printer. Sergeant David Reese, on desk duty, looked up from his paperwork, brows furrowing as James was brought in. "What's this now?" he asked, sounding weary. "Loitering outside the Regal Oak," Tom replied, tossing James's wallet, now crumpled and dirt-streaked, onto the desk. "Kept insisting he was waiting for his granddaughter, then warned us we were making a mistake." Paul smirked, crossing his arms. "Even said we'd find out soon enough." Sounded like one of those loudmouth old-timers. David skimmed the wallet but didn't bother opening it, just scribbling a few sloppy lines in the log. "Take him back," he said, not looking up. "Process him quick. I don't want messy paperwork tonight." Tom and Paul led James down a narrow hall, flickering fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. They shoved him into a small cell, the damp smell of mold rising from the concrete floor. "Welcome to your new home," Tom said, his voice gleeful, as he slammed the iron door. Through the bars, he leaned in close, smirk intact. "Get comfy, old man. Maybe your granddaughter'll bring a whole legal team to spring you, huh?" Paul stood back, letting out a dry laugh. "Or just call the president straight up," he added, his eyes flashing disdain. James sat on the metal bench in the cell, back still straight, his calm gaze passing through them. He didn't reply, didn't resist, just watched. A silence that only fueled Tom and Paul's smugness. "Gone quiet now, huh?" Tom said, turning to Paul. "Guess he's too scared to talk." Paul nodded, tapping his baton lightly on the bars. "Typical big shots until they're locked up." then they're out of moves. Outside the precinct, Olivia stood on the sidewalk, clutching her phone, her face flushed with anger and worry. She'd called James with no answer, and the video she'd recorded, him being cuffed and shoved into the car, trembled in her hands. She raced to Precinct 12, heels pounding the pavement. "I need to see him," she yelled, bursting through the door to face David Reese at the desk. "My grandfather, James Carter, you arrested him for no reason." David looked up, brows knitting again, but his demeanor didn't shift. "Calm down," he said, his voice flat. "He's held for loitering. No big deal. You want to see him. Wait till morning. Processing's not done." Olivia slammed her hand on the desk, her voice shaking. "He's James Carter, former Supreme Court Justice. You don't know what you've just done." David sighed, shaking his head like she was a kid exaggerating. "His granddaughter, huh?" he asked, jotting another line in the log. "Sit down and wait. No one here cares who he used to be." In the cell, James heard Olivia's shouts echo down the hall, but he didn't stir. He knew she was trying, but he also knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. Tom and Paul returned, catching her words, and laughed harder. "Supreme Court Justice, huh?" Tom said, tapping the bars. "Bet you know the president too, right?" Paul tilted his head, his gaze mocking. "Tell us more stories, old man. We're all ears." James finally looked up, his eyes locking onto them. "I told you you're making a mistake," he repeated, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "And I don't need to tell stories. You'll see for yourselves." Tom's laugh faltered, a flicker of unease in his eyes, but then he shrugged, walking off. "Keep dreaming in there," he said, pulling Paul along. The hall door shut, leaving James in silence, but he wasn't afraid. He knew one chance, one call, and everything would shift. Outside, Olivia gripped her phone, fingers flying to find a number that could help, determined not to let this fade away. In the small cell at Precinct 12, James Carter sat still on the metal bench, the flickering fluorescent light casting shadows on his face. Olivia's shouts still rang in his mind, but he didn't move, showing no trace of worry. He'd been waiting for this moment, not to plead, but to set in motion the wheels of justice he knew would crush the arrogance of those mocking him. Beyond the hall, Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn's footsteps faded, their snickers still bouncing off the bars. But James didn't care. He knew their time was running out. At the front desk, Olivia stood before Sergeant David Reese, her hand clenched around her phone, face red with fury. "You can't hold him without cause," she said, her voice sharp but trembling. "I demand to see him now." David leaned back in his chair, his lazy gaze sliding over her. "I told you, girl," he replied, his tone flat. "Processing's not done. He'll get his call when we're ready. Now sit down, or get out." Olivia gritted her teeth, her fingers darting across her phone screen, searching for a name in her contacts, someone who could change everything. In the cell, the hall's iron door screeched open, and Paul stepped in, holding an old desk phone. "All right, old man," he said, a hint of irritation in his voice. "That girl out there's making too much noise, so we're giving you your call. Don't bother with a lawyer. They won't do squat." He set the phone on the floor, its long cord just reaching through the bars, then crossed his arms, watching with a mocking stare. "Go ahead. Let's see what you can do." James rose slowly, stepping to the bars, his calm eyes locking onto Paul for a moment, before he bent to pick up the receiver. He dialed with the precision of someone who'd memorized the number long ago. The phone rang twice, before a warm, steady female voice answered. "Sarah Mitchell." The voice said, crisp, but authoritative. James took a breath, his tone low, and even as he spoke, "Sarah, it's me, James Carter." There was a brief pause on the line, then Sarah's voice shifted to shock. "James, what's going on? Where are you calling from?" James glanced at Paul, still standing there smirking, then replied, his voice unwavering. "I'm at Precinct 12, Charlotte. 2 officers, Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn, detained me without cause. Sergeant David Reese is on duty. They didn't check my ID, didn't care who I am. I'm locked up for loitering outside the Regal Oak." Sarah exhaled hard, the sound clear through the receiver. They did what? Her tone swung from surprise to anger, sharp as it had been arguing before the bench. James, are you okay? Did they do anything to you? James kept his voice steady, like he was reciting a legal brief. I'm fine, but they need a lesson, Sarah. I'm leaving this to you. Paul, a few steps away, started tapping his foot, his eyes flickering with suspicion at James's odd confidence. Sarah went quiet for a second, then her voice turned steely, unrelenting. Tom Hayes, Paul Dunn, David Reese, she repeated, as if committing each name to memory. They'll pay for this, James. I'm calling Robert Kane at the DOJ right now. You stay put. I'll have this handled within the hour. James nodded, though she couldn't see. Thank you, Sarah, he said, his voice soft, but carrying unmistakable weight. I knew you would. He set the receiver down, sliding the phone back through the bars toward Paul. The officer picked it up, his gaze flicking over James with a mix of curiosity and scorn. Done, old man? Paul asked, his tone still mocking. Who'd you call? A fellow judge? He laughed loudly, turning to leave, but James didn't answer. He sat back on the bench, back straight, a faint smile crossing his lips, the smile of a man who knew a storm was coming. At the front desk, Olivia finally connected with someone on her phone. Robert, it's me, Olivia, she said urgently. My grandfather, James Carter, is detained at Precinct 12. They won't release him, won't listen to me. You have to do something. On the other end, Robert Kane's voice came through, deep and firm. I just got word from Chief Justice Mitchell. I'm on my way, Olivia. Stay calm. We'll get him out soon. The calls were made, and Sarah Mitchell, Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, wasn't one for empty words. Tom, Paul, and David didn't know it yet, but their fates were sealed the moment James picked up that phone. In the cell at Precinct 12, James Carter sat still, his calm eyes peering through the bars. That faint smile lingered on his lips, a sign of confidence Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn couldn't fathom. Paul's footsteps had faded, but the precinct's air began to shift, a vague tension seeping through the concrete walls. James didn't have to wait long. The call to Sarah Mitchell had set off a machine that his captors couldn't stop. At the front desk, Olivia leaned against the wall, clutching her phone, her eyes anxious but resolute. She'd just spoken with Robert Kane, Assistant U.S. Attorney, and now it was only a matter of time. The sound of a car screeching to a halt outside the precinct rang out. The glass door shoved open, and Robert strode in, his presence commanding in a black suit, Olivia trailing behind. Sergeant David Reese looked up from his paperwork, brows furrowing, as Robert marched straight toward him. Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Kane, Department of Justice, Robert said, his voice deep and sharp, flashing his badge in David's face. I need James Carter released immediately. David blinked, his hand pausing over the keyboard, his gaze flicking from Robert to Olivia. Release who? He asked, his tone hesitant. The old guy we picked up for loitering? Robert leaned forward, planting his hands on the desk, his eyes locking onto David's. James Carter, former U.S. Supreme Court Justice. You detained him illegally, didn't verify his identity, and had no justifiable cause. I just got a direct order from Chief Justice Sarah Mitchell. Let him go, or I'll launch a full investigation tonight. Olivia stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. I told you, you locked up my grandfather and wouldn't listen to me. David exhaled through his nose, his eyes wavering, but he tried to stay composed. We were just following procedure, he said, his voice fading. Robert cut him off, his tone unrelenting. Your procedure violated the civil rights of one of this country's lawmakers. Open the cell now, or I'll have a federal team here in 10 minutes. David hesitated, then stood, grabbing a ring of keys from a drawer with slightly shaky hands. He led Robert and Olivia down the hall, their shoes echoing sharply on the floor. When the iron door swung open, James looked up, his calm eyes meeting theirs. He rose and stepped out of the cell with no rush, as if leaving a meeting rather than a lockup. Olivia rushed forward, hugging him tightly. Are you okay? She asked, her voice choked. James rested a hand on her shoulder, smiling faintly. I'm fine, Olivia, thank you. He turned to Robert, nodding. Robert, good to see you. Tom and Paul, just back from the break room, froze at the sight unfolding. Tom frowned, his voice thick with suspicion. What's going on? Why's he out? Paul crossed his arms, his gaze sliding over Robert with a hint of scorn. Someone call a lawyer. Robert turned, his eyes cutting like a blade. Not a lawyer. I'm an assistant U.S. attorney, and you just detained James Carter without cause. The DOJ's investigating this. I suggest you brace yourselves. Tom smirked, but it couldn't hide the unease flickering through. An investigation over some old guy loitering. Paul jumped in, his voice harder. We followed protocol. He didn't cooperate. James stepped forward, his voice low but clear, slicing through the air. You'll soon know what cooperation means, he said, his gaze locking onto them. I warned you. Tom opened his mouth to retort, but Robert's stare silenced him. David, behind the desk, started flipping through the log, sweat rolling down his forehead. I didn't know who he was, he muttered, as if justifying himself. Robert didn't bother replying, turning to James. How do you want to handle this? James scanned the precinct, his eyes lingering on Tom, Paul, and David for a long moment. I'll leave the rest to you and Sarah, he said, but I want them to remember this. Robert nodded, pulling out his phone, his voice low as he spoke to someone on the other end. Start the investigation on Precinct 12. I need internal affairs and federal auditors here by morning. He hung up, turning back to Tom and Paul. You should get lawyers. You'll need them. Olivia stood beside James, gripping his hand, her eyes blazing with resolve. They won't get away with it, she said, her voice quiet but certain. As James stepped out of the precinct, Charlotte's cool air enveloped him. He paused on the sidewalk, glancing back at Precinct 12's glass door, where Tom and Paul still stood, their eyes now tinged with doubt and worry. David retreated inside, his hands trembling, as he shut the logbook. James said nothing more, but he knew the investigation was just the start. The DOJ was in motion, and Sarah Mitchell didn't do things halfway. His captors, Tom, Paul, and even David, would soon realize they hadn't just faced an old man, but a system James had helped build. He walked off, Olivia at his side, the wheels of justice spinning faster than ever. Olivia held his hand, her eyes still burning with determination, while Robert Kane stood nearby, phone to his ear, his voice low but sharp, as he issued orders to the federal team. Inside the precinct, Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn lingered in the hall, their eyes now a mix of doubt and worry, though their arrogance hadn't fully faded. Sergeant David Reese shrank into a corner, hands shaking as he closed the log, sweat streaking his forehead. They didn't know the wheels of justice James had set in motion were already turning at an unstoppable pace. The next morning, Precinct 12 became the eye of a storm. Sleek black cars from internal affairs and federal auditors lined the entrance, agents in gray suits stepping out with thick briefcases. Robert Kane led the charge, his gaze steely as he strode through the glass door, trailed by a DOJ investigation team. Captain Henry Brooks, the precinct's head, stood in his upstairs office, peering down through the window, his face pale. His desk phone rang incessantly, but he didn't dare pick it up. A call from higher-ups had come half an hour earlier, their icy voice demanding an explanation for the mess. Tom and Paul were summoned to a meeting room, the mockery gone from their eyes. Robert stood before the table, holding a thick file, his voice hammering down. Tom Hayes, Paul Dunn, he said, tossing the file onto the table. You've got a string of violations over 3 years, baseless arrests, excessive force, and now this, with James Carter. You're suspended effective immediately, pending a full investigation. Tom pushed back, his voice shaky but defiant. We were just doing our jobs. He was loitering, uncooperative. Paul cut in, his eyes flashing anger. You've got nothing on us. Robert leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Nothing? We've got video from his granddaughter, James Carter's testimony, and your past records internal affairs just dug up. You're done. Tom opened his mouth to argue, but an investigator raised a hand to silence him, placing another stack of documents on the table, a list of unresolved complaints from years past, now unearthed like a fatal blow. Paul clenched his fists, but his eyes began to waver. realizing there was no way out. Meanwhile, Olivia stood outside the precinct, her phone buzzing with texts from law firm colleagues. The video she'd recorded last night, James cuffed and shoved into the car, had gone viral on social media, racking up thousands of shares in hours. A crowd gathered in front of Precinct 12, their chants for justice echoing, signs raised high with "End Police Abuse" and "Justice for James Carter." James stood beside Olivia, his eyes calm but sharp, as he watched the crowd. He said nothing, but his presence amplified their voices. Henry Brooks finally faced reality. The phone rang again, and this time he answered, his voice trembling. "Captain Brooks," he said, but the other end didn't let him go on. A deep voice from above cut through, unrelenting. "You let 2 officers detain James Carter, without checking his identity. Do you know how far this will go? Resign now, or we'll fire you for incompetence." Henry stammered, trying to defend himself. "I didn't know who he was. I wasn't there when they brought him in." But the voice interrupted. "That's not the explanation I want to hear. You're done." James was called into Robert's office to give a statement. He sat down, his voice steady as he recounted the incident, from Tom's taunts outside the Regal Oak, to the wallet snatch, to the illegal detention. Olivia stood by, adding details from the video, and her clash with David at the desk. Robert took notes, his eyes alight with resolve. "We're not stopping here," he said. "This precinct has systemic issues. I'll push for federal oversight." As James stepped out of the office, the precinct's hall fell eerily silent. Tom and Paul were led away, hands cuffed behind them, their eyes now pure panic. David stood in a corner, avoiding James's gaze as he passed. Henry Brooks appeared at the stairs, face ashen, clutching a hastily written resignation letter. He looked at James, lips parting as if to speak, but James just nodded faintly, his eyes free of resentment, just the certainty of justice being served. Outside, the crowd cheered as James emerged, Olivia at his side, her first smile breaking through. Robert followed, giving a brief statement to the press. "The DOJ has stepped in. This is just the beginning." James scanned the crowd, his gaze lingering on their angry yet hopeful faces. He knew the investigation wouldn't stop with Tom, Paul, or Henry. It would spread, dig deeper, and change things. The wheels of justice spun hard, and he'd sparked them. The air in the Charlotte Federal Courthouse hung heavy with tense silence, broken only by the rustle of papers and the soft footsteps of court staff. James Carter sat in the witness row, composed in his familiar gray suit, his eyes quietly observing as Assistant U.S. Attorney Robert Kane prepared to open the trial. Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn sat at the defense table, cuffs removed, but their eyes now mixed panic and anger. Olivia sat behind James, clutching a stack of documents, her face set with unshakable resolve. The crowd outside the courthouse still gathered, their chants for justice seeping through the thick walls. Robert stood, his voice deep and cutting as he began. "Your Honor, today we try Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn, officers from Precinct 12, on charges of civil rights violations, abuse of power, and the illegal detention of James Carter, a former U.S. Supreme Court Justice. This isn't just a personal case. It's a symbol of systemic abuse we cannot tolerate." He turned to James, nodding slightly, then continued, "We have irrefutable evidence, video from Mr. Carter's granddaughter, the defendant's past violation records, and testimony from the victim himself." Tom clenched his fists under the table, his eyes flashing defiance, while Paul slumped, shoulders sagging as if accepting his fate. Their defense lawyer, a middle-aged man with a shaky voice, stood. "Your Honor, my clients were just maintaining order. Mr. Carter didn't cooperate, and they didn't know his identity." But Robert interrupted, his voice like a blade. "Didn't cooperate. They snatched his wallet, refused to check his ID, and mocked him even after he warned them. This wasn't law enforcement, it was racism and abuse of power." James was called to the stand. He walked slowly, placing his hand on the Bible to swear in, his eyes calm but carrying the weight of decades of legal experience. Robert approached, his tone gentle but serious. "Mr. Carter, Tell us what happened outside the Regal Oak." James took a breath, his voice ringing steady and sharp, as it had from the bench. "I was waiting for my granddaughter, Olivia, when these two officers, Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn, approached me." Hayes said, "What's an old black guy like you doing at a place like this?" "They didn't care when I said I was waiting for family. I offered my ID, but they knocked my wallet away, stomped on it, then cuffed me without cause. They took me to Precinct 12, taunted me in the cell, and denied my right to a call until Olivia forced them." The courtroom sat silent, the jury listening intently, some shaking their heads as James went on. "I warned them they were making a mistake, but they laughed, called me a trouble-making old man. They didn't know who I was, and they didn't want to know." Robert displayed Olivia's video on a large screen, James being shoved into the patrol car, Olivia's shouts ringing clear. "This is the evidence," Robert said, facing the jury. "They didn't just violate Mr. Carter's rights, they ignored the laws he helped shape." The defense lawyer tried to counter, but his voice faltered against the mountain of proof. Robert presented Tom and Paul's past records, dozens of abuse complaints, many buried by Precinct 12. As James stepped down, he looked straight at Tom and Paul, not with anger, but with the certainty of justice nearing. The jury left to deliberate, but no one in the room doubted the outcome. Hours later, they returned. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a stern gaze, struck her gavel. After reviewing the evidence, the jury finds Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn guilty of civil rights violations, abuse of power, and illegal detention. Each defendant is sentenced to 10 years in prison without parole, plus a $150,000 fine, to be donated to civil rights organizations. Applause erupted from the gallery, but James sat still, his eyes fixed on Tom and Paul as they were led away, their faces now pale, stripped of all arrogance. Robert turned to James, nodding. "This is your victory," he said. James smiled faintly. "No, it's justice's victory." Olivia gripped his hand, her eyes shining with pride. Outside, the crowd cheered as the news spread, but Robert didn't stop. He told the press, "Precinct 12 will face federal oversight. Henry Brooks has resigned, and we'll dig deeper into this system." David Reese, though not on trial today, knew he wouldn't escape the widening investigation. James stepped out of the courtroom, Charlotte's sunlight washing over him. He paused, looking at Olivia and Robert, his voice low but firm. "We're not done yet," he said. "This is just the start." Applause rang from the crowd, but James knew this win wasn't just punishment, it was a warning to others, and a spark for bigger change ahead. Afternoon sunlight streamed through the large windows of the lecture hall at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, where James Carter stood before hundreds of law students, his eyes calm but carrying the weight of a man who'd seen and shaped justice for decades. Weeks had passed since the trial convicting Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn, but the case's echoes still reverberated through Charlotte and beyond. James wore his familiar gray suit, his voice steady and sharp as he recounted the incident outside. The Regal Oak, from the officers' taunts, to the illegal detention, to the fateful call to Sarah Mitchell. The students sat rapt, some scribbling notes, others nodding silently. "This isn't just about me," James said, his gaze sweeping the auditorium. "It's a lesson in accountability, for those who enforce the law, and for all of us when we face injustice. I told them they were making a mistake, and now they've paid for it. But the real cost isn't their 10 years in prison, it's the system we have to fix." Olivia stood off stage, clutching her phone, a proud smile spreading across her face as she listened. She'd become part of this story, not just as James's granddaughter, but as a young lawyer committed to carrying on the fight against abuse of power. Outside the hall, Precinct 12 now operated under strict federal oversight. Henry Brooks had resigned, leaving a void no one dared fill hastily. David Reese, though not convicted, faced indefinite suspension, pending further investigation into his role. The remaining officers worked with caution, their eyes now wary as they glanced through walls where they once wielded power with confidence. Robert Kane, from the DOJ office, told the press the investigation had expanded to other precincts across North Carolina. "This isn't just one station," he said, his voice low but firm. "We're looking at a bigger problem, and we'll address it." James concluded his speech, his voice dropping but brimming with strength. "Justice doesn't come on its own. It demands action, not just when we're the victims, but whenever we see injustice anywhere." The students erupted in applause, standing to cheer as he stepped off the podium. Olivia approached, hugging him tightly. "You did it," she said, her eyes shining. James smiled faintly, resting a hand on her shoulder. "No, Olivia, we did it, and you'll keep it going." She nodded, her gaze blazing with a promise to keep the flame alive. As James stepped out of the hall, Charlotte's sunlight bathed him, highlighting the dignified stance of a man who'd become an unwilling symbol. The crowd outside the courthouse had dispersed, but his story still spread, on social media, in articles, and over dinner tables. Olivia's video now had millions of views, each share a reminder of resilience and accountability's power. James paused on the steps, looking out over the city, where he'd once been just an old black man to Tom and Paul. Now, he was a spark igniting hope for others. Robert met James and Olivia outside, holding a fresh stack of documents. "We just launched a retraining program for police statewide," he said. "Your case was the catalyst. We're changing how they see their jobs." James nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Good," he said simply. "But don't stop. There's more to do." Robert smiled, nodding in agreement. "We won't stop, sir." James turned to Olivia, his eyes gentle but serious. "You'll be the one to carry on, Olivia. I've done my part." She gripped his hand, her voice steady. "I won't let you down." They descended the steps, sunlight enveloping them, like a promise of the future. Precinct 12 might have changed, Tom and Paul might have been punished, but James Carter's legacy, resilience, justice, and change, would outlast concrete walls or steel bars. The story of James Carter in ** Racist cops arrest elderly black man until he makes one phone call to the Supreme Court" reflects real issues plaguing the U.S. today, especially racism, police abuse of power, and the strength of community in fighting for justice. James's illegal arrest by Tom Hayes and Paul Dunn, outside the Regal Oak, just for being an elderly black man, reveals the lingering bias in American society, where skin color can still spark suspicion, even in progressive cities like Charlotte, North Carolina. His call to Sarah Mitchell and Robert Kane's DOJ intervention highlight the critical role of the legal system and those in power in correcting injustice, a reality seen in cases like George Floyd or Breonna Taylor, where justice only came after massive public and institutional pressure. The trial sentencing Tom and Paul to 10 years, and Henry Brooks's resignation show that individual and systemic accountability can be enforced, but only with strict oversight, like internal affairs in the story, something many U.S. communities now demand through movements like Black Lives Matter. The lesson here isn't just to stand against injustice, but to act decisively and use every available resource. Like Olivia recording and sharing the video, you too can use social media to expose truth, as Americans do today, capturing police abuse. James's patience waiting for his call to Sarah teaches us that strategy, not just rash reaction, is key. Find allies, like Robert or Sarah, in your community or legal system to drive change. Ultimately, James's legacy reminds us justice doesn't come free. It demands you, like the YouTube audience in this story, act and share a very American call. Each person has the power to shift the system, step by step, if they don't give up. Don't forget to subscribe to join us in fighting for justice like James Carter did. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video to explore more world-changing stories. Hit subscribe so you don't miss justice journeys like James and Olivia's. We're grateful for your support, and we'll be back soon with a new video.